Okay, so a massive new law just landed. And if you're trying to make sense of the hundreds of pages of dense legal text, believe me, you are not alone. But don't you worry, because that's exactly what we're going to do today. We are going to deconstruct Public Law 119-21 piece by piece and figure out what it actually means for you. So the big question is, what is actually hiding inside this monster of a document? We're talking almost 400 pages here. Well, it's a whole mix of things: tax cuts, major healthcare reforms, a reshuffling of national priorities, and a pretty clear vision for the future. So let's dive in and break it all down. Here's the game plan for our tour. We're going to start with the stuff that hits closest to home. Your wallet and your health. From there, we'll zoom out and look at the bigger picture: how this law affects the nation's food supply, its security, and where it's placing its bets on future tech and energy. First up, let's get right to it and talk about something that impacts literally everyone: money. This law kicks off with some really significant changes to the tax code, and they seem to be aimed right at the middle class. And the relief here is pretty direct. For service industry workers, this could mean no more federal income tax on tips. For others, there's a new break on overtime pay. You might even be able to deduct the interest on your car loan. And for anyone who owns a home, they're changing the rules for deducting your state and local taxes, the SALT deduction, which could be a really big deal, especially if you live in a high-tax state. The law also introduces something completely new, and they're calling them Trump accounts. The easiest way to think about them is like a starter investment account for kids. It gets set up when they're born, and it can be funded by rollovers from the government or nonprofits. The whole idea seems to be about playing the long game. The money is put into simple, low-fee index funds, and it stays locked up, growing until that person turns 18. All right, so we've covered your financial health. Now let's pivot to your physical health. Section 2 of this law makes some really big moves when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare, which, as you know, are the healthcare safety nets for tens of millions of Americans.
And to really understand these changes, you have to get the philosophy behind them. There's a phrase pulled directly from a heading in the law itself that tells you almost everything you need to know: preventing wasteful spending. That phrase is basically the lens through which you should view all of these adjustments.
So, what does that philosophy look like in practice? Well, we see a pause on new staffing rules for nursing homes. We also see a phase-out of the extra federal funding, that's the FMAP incentive, the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage, that was given to states to encourage them to expand Medicaid. But it's not all about pulling back. The law also carves out money for a brand new Rural Health Transformation Program, which is a targeted investment to boost healthcare access outside of the big cities. Now, this next one is probably one of the most significant changes, and it's getting a lot of attention. It introduces new community engagement rules for Medicaid. Basically, states will now have to require some able-bodied recipients to either work, get job training, or do community service for at least 80 hours a month. States will be checking on this, and if someone doesn't meet the requirement, they could lose their coverage. So, just like the law reshapes healthcare, it's also making some fundamental changes to our food safety net. Section 3, which is called the Nation's Table, really gets into the nitty-gritty of policies that affect the food on our plates and the people who grow it. And you're gonna see a familiar theme here. Just like with Medicaid, there are modified work requirements for some SNAP recipients. But maybe the biggest structural change is that it locks in something called the Thrifty Food Plan from 2021. That plan is the formula used to calculate benefits, and this move basically freezes it in place. The law also shifts more of the administrative burden onto the states, cutting the federal share of those costs in half starting in 2027. But it's not all about changing rules. This chart shows us where some new money is flowing. You can see a pretty big bump in funding for what are called specialty crops, plus dedicated money for collecting data on organic farming, and even for a sheep marketing program. It's a pretty clear signal of support for these smaller, more niche parts of the agriculture industry. Okay, let's pull the camera way back now. We're moving from the kitchen table to the global stage. Section 4 is all about the big picture, how this law is redefining our national priorities, from our military all the way to our borders. And wow, the spending here is serious. Just look at these numbers for a second. Over $2.2 billion for hypersonic defense alone. That tells you a lot about where the military sees the threats of the future. There's also almost $2 billion for better missile defense radars and a huge $1.5 billion investment in just maintaining our shipyards, which is a clear sign they want to improve the readiness of our naval fleet. Now on the Homeland Security side, the strategy laid out here really has multiple layers. Yes, there's money appropriated for new physical barriers, but there's also funding for more people, more CBP personnel, more vehicles, bigger facilities, and a big investment in better technology, like surveillance towers. It's an approach that combines infrastructure, personnel, and tech.
So, after we've talked about all that spending, we arrive at this number: $5 trillion. That's the staggering amount by which this law increases the nation's debt limit. It's the borrowing authority needed to pay for everything that we've just talked about. So after going through all that spending and all those new rules, you have to wonder, where is this all going? What's the long-term vision? Well, our final section looks right at the horizon, exploring how this law tries to set the stage for the future of our technology, our energy, and even our place in space. A huge piece of the tech puzzle is something you can't even see: radio spectrum. The best way to think of it is like invisible highways for all our wireless data. This timeline sets a hard deadline for the FCC to auction off a huge chunk of that spectrum for companies to use. The idea is to open up those highways for the next generation of wireless tech, with major auctions happening by 2029 and everything wrapped up by 2033.
The law also looks, well, way up. It makes a significant down payment on our future in space. There's new money for the Artemis missions to get us back to the moon, and for the even bigger Moon to Mars program. It also secures funding to keep the International Space Station running through 2029 and pumps hundreds of millions into upgrading the crucial ground infrastructure at NASA's key facilities.
And finally, we come to energy, where this law makes a very clear pivot. On one side, you have an America First approach. This extends tax credits for things like carbon capture and advanced nuclear, and it also mandates new oil and gas lease sales. But on the other side, the law rescinds, which is a fancy way of saying it takes back, unspent money from several green initiatives like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So you see this dual strategy, boosting some energy sectors while pulling back funding from others. So when you put all the pieces together, the targeted tax cuts, the new requirements for social programs, the renewed focus on defense and border security, and this huge shift in energy and tech, you're left with one big question. What story is this law trying to tell about the nation's vision for its own future? That, I think, is the question this whole thing leaves us with.